If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, now we can. Because as the band just sang, we're back. We're back to where we once belonged. And a big hand to Russ who wrote that song. And for the band for pulling it off, man. It was just like being at a Beatles concert. It was awesome. So thanks very much. But, as you heard in that clip over and over again, we're back. And my hope way back then in March 2020 was that we would be back soon. Now, depending on your perspective, it was like that. It's like it's just like we never left. Or it's like, oh man, I can't believe it took that long to get back here. It all depends on how you see things, right? For instance, compared to 18 days, 18 months is a long time, right? 18 months compared to 18 years or 18 centuries, no time at all. It's a matter of perspective, and perspective matters. As Russ mentioned, we're in the middle of a series called Magnify, where what we're really doing is looking at the things that we tend to magnify rather than looking at the things we ought to magnify. And we used a telescope and a microscope to help us, use them as a metaphor to help us understand what it is we're talking about. So, for instance, a telescope and a microscope do the same thing, virtually the same thing. They magnify things, right? But they do it in different ways. For example, a microscope takes things that are small and makes them appear bigger and larger than they actually are. It literally blows them out of proportion. A telescope, on the other hand, takes things that are relatively or actually are massive but appear small and makes them look more like they actually are. I mentioned last week that how right now, if you get up early in the morning, well, I get up, it's ridiculous how early I get up, but about 6 in the morning, just before the sun comes up, over Mount Benson, you can see Jupiter with the naked eye. It doesn't look like much, though. It looks like a dot in the sky, even though it is the largest planet in our solar system. But if you telescope it, you look at it through a telescope, man, it actually helps you see it as it actually is. That's the difference between a microscope and a telescope. Well, today we're going to look at something that we tend to microscope, that we focus in on, and we tend to do this quite a bit, probably more so than anything else, and it's our weaknesses. We microscope our weaknesses. And it seems as though, and I'll just throw this out there for you to consider, but it seems to me as though that it's kind of in our nature to do that, to focus and almost obsess on not just our weaknesses, but the weaknesses of others. I noticed this over the last couple of weeks. My wife and I have been watching the Olympics. Go Canada, go. I mean, they're over now. They got the Paralympics coming up, but Canada did awesome. We won the most medals we've ever won. But because maybe I was getting this message ready, it was top of mind for me, but I just seemed to notice that every time the commentators would be talking about an athlete competing in whatever event it happened to be, that more often than not, they would always talk about a weakness they had. Like, oh, they don't do this very well, and their tendency is to do that. And it just kind of seemed like, wow, like instead of, they're at the Olympics for crying out loud. But they don't do this right. And this played out in this 50-kilometer race walk, which kind of sounds like an oxymoron, doesn't it? Race walk? How do you do that? But anyway, these two commentators were talking about this Polish athlete who was quite a ways out in front of everyone else. He had like a 2.5, 3-minute lead or something. And this one commentator kept saying how, although he's way in the lead and it looks like he's going to get gold, he does have a weakness. And it's this: he tends to come out too fast. And then in the end, the backstretch of the race, he kind of slows down, allowing his competitors to catch him and pass him. And so he said, so don't count the gold medal just yet. Well, the guy went on to win the gold medal, but it was interesting how this guy tended, instead of, focusing on his strength. He was out in front. It was focusing on his weaknesses. Check this out. This is a great example of how we tend to zoom in on weaknesses. This is the draft report from the 2000 NFL draft. It was about a quarterback who was eventually picked 199th in the 6th round. So he's way down the depth chart. And here's why he ended up there. Here's what the scouting report said about him. He has a poor build. He's skinny. He lacks great physical stature and strength. He lacks a really strong arm. He lacks mobility and the ability to avoid the rush. He can't drive the ball downfield. He doesn't throw a really tight spiral. He's a systems-type player who can get exposed if he's forced to ad-lib a play, and he gets knocked down easily. That scouting report was for this guy, Tom Brady. Yeah, I love him or hate him. You know, I know I'm showing his picture in church, but 6 Super Bowl rings later, right? Now, here's the thing. There is nothing wrong at all with being aware of our weaknesses. There's nothing wrong with that because there's no other way to improve them, right? You don't know what you don't know, and if you're not aware of your weaknesses, well, you'll just carry on doing what you're doing. The problem is that when we look at our weaknesses, we tend to microscope them, and we make them bigger than they actually are. And we do it to the point that overcoming them seems overwhelming. And so we just resign our fact to, well, that's just the way it's going to be. There's no point trying to change. And we just don't. Now, this it's not new. It's not like this is a 21st century thing. We see this dynamic of microscoping weaknesses play out in arguably one of the most well-known stories from the Bible. It's the story of David and Goliath. This story is found in the Old Testament in a book called First Samuel. It's about halfway through. There's 31 chapters, I think, in Samuel, First Samuel. This is in chapter 17, so about halfway through. And this story starts like any great story does, by creating tension, creating the scene, and introducing the characters. And so here's the scene, the backdrop for this story. Listen to this. This is how this whole story starts. The Philistines now mustered their army for battle. Saul, the king of Israel, countered by gathering his Israelite troops near the valley of Elah. So the Philistines and the Israelites faced each other on opposite hills with the valley between them. So just to help you picture that, think Braveheart or 300. You've got these two armies amassed, facing one another, and they're both waiting for someone to make the first move, to flinch. Enter the antagonist of the story. Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. And then the author goes to describe what this guy's like, his description. Listen to this. He was over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. He also wore bronze leg armor, and I heard that weighed 15 pounds each. He carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was as heavy and as thick as a weaver's beam. Weaver's beam is what they used to weave material, and it would hang the threads and keep them taut. And a weaver's beam was between 2.5 and 3 inches thick. It's a big spear to be hanging on to. And it had an iron spearhead that weighed another 15 pounds. This guy was intimidating. And when I read that description, I was thinking, okay, what is a good character? Like, what do I think of? And for some reason, I thought of Drago from Rocky 400. Well, actually, it was Rocky 4, but he was Rocky Balboa's opponent, right? Do you remember Drago's nickname? Yeah, I didn't either. I had to look it up. But it was the Siberian Express. And he was so named because his punch was as fast and as powerful as a locomotive. And when it hit you, you felt like you were being run over by a train. And so as I was sitting there in my office putting this together, I was thinking, man, I wonder if Goliath had a nickname. And if he did, maybe it would be something like the Philistine Punisher or the Annihilator or the Bone Crusher, something like that, right? And for 40 days and nights, this guy, his boasts just belched through this valley. And he screamed at the Israelite army, "This day I defy." He's throwing it right in their face. "I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." And then he tagged on this little thing where, and if he wins, we're your slaves. But if I win, you're our slaves. There's a lot at stake. And so on hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. And so nobody moved. Nobody stepped up to volunteer to meet Goliath and take him on. That is until David. David arrives on the scene. He's been tasked by his father to take some bread and cheese to the troops on the front line, including his brothers. And his dad says, while you're there, get a report and bring it back to me. I want to know how my sons are doing. Which was funny because there was no battle. There was just a lot of posturing going on. But he arrives, and he meets up with his brothers on the front line, and he gives them the bread. And it's then that he hears Goliath's taunt. When he steps out and he defies the whole nation of Israel. And it was then that David made his decision. He makes his way to the king and says, "Don't worry about this Philistine. I'll go fight him." And listen to Saul's response. "Don't be ridiculous. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth." Kind of an echo of that NFL scout, no? Saul lists off all of David's weaknesses, why he can't do this. You're too young, you're too skinny. Your physical stature's just not there. You don't have the strength. You're not the guy. You don't have what it takes. King Saul microscoped David's weaknesses, and he did it because he had already microscoped Goliath. And he had microscoped it to the point where Goliath was undefeatable. He was too large. He was too menacing. He made him bigger than he actually was. And he wasn't alone. Every single one of his fighting men had done the same thing. It says, as soon as the Israelite army saw him, referring to Goliath, they began to run away in fright. He was all they could see. And that's exactly what happens when we microscope things in our lives, including our weaknesses. They become bigger than they really are. It gets blown out of proportion, which does us absolutely no good because our problems are big enough to begin with. See, this doesn't diminish. When we microscope, it's not diminishing the problem. It's just making it bigger than it needs to be. And so here's the bottom line. If I had to bottom line this, if we simply look at our weaknesses through the lens of a microscope, our weaknesses will overwhelm us and defeat us every single day. Which is exactly what happened to the men in this story. Every day, twice a day, Goliath would step onto that valley floor and he would just taunt them. Come on, if you think you got it, let's go. I'm not afraid of you. And they would respond like this. Have you seen the giant? Have you seen how big he is? Man, he's massive. There's no way we can beat him. And he comes out each day to defy Israel. Yeah, there is a powerful, powerful truth that runs through the biblical narrative. And it's on full display in this story. And it's this. God has a way of doing miraculous things, magnificent things, when we are weak. If I had to put it another way, I'd say it this way. Our weaknesses are where God shows up. Our weaknesses are where God shows up. That was the case for David. He had already experienced God's power firsthand in his life. He was a shepherd boy by trade. That was his job. And his job was to protect the sheep at all costs. And that meant from wild animals and everything else. And so the first words out of David's mouth after Saul said, "Man, you're too small. You can't do it. You're too weak." The first words out of David's mouth as he defends himself and says, "Look, I want to go take this guy on," he says this, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." You see, what David did is he telescoped God. He magnified God's power, which in turn gave him the courage and the confidence to face his foe, to step on to the field of battle. I mean, yeah, King Saul, he was absolutely right when he said David was too young, he was too small, he was too weak. He was absolutely right. And it would have been easy for David to go, yeah, you're right, okay. But instead of microscoping his weaknesses, David chooses to telescope God and focus on his strength and his power. And it allowed him to shift his perspective, to hold them up against each other. Goliath here, God here. And what he saw was Goliath was no match for who he knew God was. And what I love about it is David goes out and he lets Goliath know it. Goliath comes out and he mocks David right away. He mocks the whole Israelite army. "What? You're sending a boy to fight me? Really?" And he looks at David and he says, "You dog." David, I love David's reply. He says, "You come at me with sword and spear and javelin. I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I will strike you down. This day the Lord will hand you, and I'll strike you down. All those gathered here will know that it is not by the sword or the spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's." Those are beautiful words to hang on to. And I love the assurance with which David speaks them. He says, "The Lord will hand you over. This day I will strike you down. All those gathered here will hear and know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves." He doesn't say, "Well, hopefully God will hand you to me. I'm pretty sure I'm going to strike you down today. I think people are going to know who God is." No, he knows without a doubt that God is there with him, and it's his power that's going to give him the strength to overcome his foe. And he knows it because he knows God. It can be so easy to just look at the story and kind of put it in the corporate world. You know, you got the little business against the big business, and it's a little guy against the big guy. So it's this David versus Goliath thing. But I want to throw this out there for you, that this is more of a story about God focus versus giant focus. And what we are focused on is going to determine what we see, and more importantly, what we do next. The men in this story, they microscoped Goliath to the point where they could not move, would not advance. David telescoped God, and he's like, let's go. Let's go get this guy. Now, interestingly, I found it fascinating that in this story, later on in the Bible, David is referred to as a man after God's own heart. It says, and here's the thing. God never used those words. He didn't use them, glibly, like just, oh, he's a man after my own heart. He only used it to describe David, which, he didn't use it to describe Moses or Abraham or Solomon or Peter, Paul, John, Ringo. None of those guys. None of them were tagged a man after God's own heart, which seems really odd if you continue to read through David's story. I mean, I asked the question, what did God see in this guy? Because it seems he tripped up and fell down more than he stood. He fell more often than he ran. I mean, yeah, he stood up to Goliath, yet he fell to adultery. He led armies and led a nation, but he couldn't even manage his own family. It was a mess. I mean, talking about nuts falling out of the family tree, read his family tree. A man after God's own heart, really? Yet here's the thing. The fact that God saw him that way, even the way he was, it should bring all of us hope. It brings me hope because I'm a lot like David. Sure, I walk and I run with God and I think, oh, look at me go. But then I trip and I fall and I stumble, crash. And I do it over and over and over again. I find hope because I had a giant stalk me for years. And you know what? It got the best of me over and over and over again. Now, my giant wasn't 9 feet tall, didn't carry a bronze javelin, didn't wear a 125-pound size 70 coat of armor. My giant was 4.5 inches tall and about the thickness of my finger. My giant and my weakness was my addiction to cigarettes. I knew the dangers of smoking. I mean, it's hard not to know them. And so for years, I would attempt to go onto the battlefield and kind of slay this dragon of my nicotine cravings. But inevitably, I would fall prey to the taunts of my giant. It just kept pressing in on my weaknesses, getting me to magnify them. He'd say things like, who are you trying to kid, man? Do you really want to go through all of that again? All the nick fits, the dry mouth, the sweats, the mood swings. Do you seriously want to go through all that again? Come on, just one puff, one drag. And so I would. I'd take a drag. And then it was, you know what, dude, just have one cigarette in the morning. Take the edge off. And so I would. And then it was, well, have one after lunch. You know how good that tastes. And so I would. What about one after dinner? It's only 3. Pfft, compared to what you smoked before, that's nothing. And so I would. And then it would be like, why don't you just buy a pack? Who's going to know? And so I would. And in essence, what I was doing was losing the battle. And I'd walk off the battlefield with my head and shoulders stooped and slouched in defeat. You see, what I was doing is I had become giant focused. And there was no way I could get through this. I tried. There's no way. I just microscoped those cravings until they were all I could see, all I could think about, all I could hear. And I was just honest. I would ask myself, do I want to go through the neck fits and all the sweats and everything else? And like, no, not a chance. I don't want to do that again. Do I want to face all the discomfort, all the pain that comes with it? No, I don't want to do that. It's too hard. It's too big. It's too overwhelming. So I'd far easier to just give in. And that's when the taunts would shift from, come on, just a puff, to, ha, gotcha. I got you again. You've blown it again. What's God going to think of you now? What's your family going to think? What are your friends going to think? Loser. I need David's story. I think you do too. Because we all have giants lurking in our lives. Giants of rejection, failure, revenge, remorse, fear, which we're going to talk about next week. Giants that we desperately want to defeat. But like the giant in this story, they have to be faced in order to be defeated. But here's the beautiful thing about this story. We don't need to face them alone. But when we microscope a problem, an issue, a weakness, it becomes the only thing we can see, so we can't see past it to see God who is with us. Now, I finally was able to defeat my 4.5-inch tall giant. And looking back, there's only one reason I was able to do it. It's when I became God-focused. Up until that point, I had tried to do it on my own. And then one day I can't do this. I can't do this anymore. And I remember it was almost the most audible voice I've ever heard of God. It wasn't audible, but it sure felt like it. It was just like, I'll be there with you, walking with you. You can do this. We can do this. And what I was able to do is what David did. I relied on God's power. I magnified that instead of microscoping the problem. And that power is available to every single one of us, should we choose to tap into it. When you and I take the time to really dig into who God is and what he's like, and allow him to love us, and invest time getting to know him, we'll discover what people have been discovering about God for centuries. That God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Take that verse and stick it on your fridge. Put it as your screensaver on your phone. At the end of the day, the question we need to ask is this: what am I magnifying? God's power or my weakness? It's a question worth exploring. And I'm really glad that you decided to spend some of your time with us this morning, whether that online or here in person. So great to see everybody. Like, this is like better than caffeine in the morning. But if you heard something in the message, if you hear those whispers, those taunts, and you're thinking, I have tried to get over this thing and I can't. And you're ready to just throw your hands up in resignation. But you're just feeling, I just need to talk to somebody. We've got awesome team of people online, our hosts, that would love to talk with you, pray with you, whatever you need. You just simply click on request prayer. You'll be directed to them. Or here at the theater, in Theater 5, we've got some people that are willing to do the same. Or if you just need a quiet space to just go off by yourself or with a friend, Theater 5 right next door. So take advantage of that. But at the end of the day, I'm so pumped that I get to be on this journey with you. As we link arms together to magnify and hone in on who God is, how awesome he is, and how much power he is, and how he's willing to work with us through whatever it is we're facing. Thanks again for taking the time to be here this morning. I invite you to pray with me. God, we've all got giants. They come in all shapes, all forms, all sizes. They're all different things. And our tendency is often to just magnify, like microscope in on them and make them larger and bigger than they need to be, than they actually are. What we need to do is just step back and telescope you and get a picture of what you're like. Even though sometimes you can feel far away, when we telescope you, you come into view and we get to see you as you actually are. And then held up into relation of what our problem is, we can see how big you are. And there's nothing that we can face here, even death itself, that is too big for you. That should bring us so much hope and so much peace. And so I pray that for all of us. As we make our way through this week, that we would just telescope you. And that doesn't mean we diminish our problems or anything like that. They're real. We've got to work through them. But we don't have to do it alone, because we have an awesome God like you that loves us so much. And we thank you for that love. And we pray all of this in your awesome name. Amen.